Margaret Holloway woke to the sound of rain pattering softly against the windows, the sky outside heavy with grey clouds that seemed to press down upon her small Somerset cottage. She lay still for a long moment, staring at the ceiling, her chest rising and falling with the weight of memory that refused to loosen its grip. It was the 20-year anniversary of the day her two grandchildren, Emily, who had been 10, and Thomas, who had been 8, had vanished from her farm. And though every passing year had been a torment, this morning felt markedly different, as if the air itself was holding its breath. She swung her legs from the bed slowly, her bones aching with age, her heart aching with loss, and moved across the room to the dressing table where an old framed photograph waited like a sentinel. In it, Emily smiled with a missing tooth, and Thomas stood with his toy car clenched in his hand, the two of them laughing as though nothing in the world could ever harm them. Margaret's wrinkled fingers traced their faces, and for a fleeting moment she almost imagined she could feel the warmth of their cheeks again, but the chill of reality set in, and she drew back with a shudder. Downstairs the kettle hissed and clicked, steam curling up into the kitchen ceiling as she prepared her morning tea with trembling hands, her mind circling back to that dreadful day in 2004, when she had turned from the washing line to find silence where the children's voices had been moments before. Even now, after all the interviews, searches, and hopeless appeals for information, the image of the empty yard haunted her. A scene burned into her mind with cruel precision. She carried her cup into the sitting room where the grandfather clock ticked solemnly, each chime a reminder of the years lost, and sat in her favorite chair by the window, staring out over the damp fields that had once been filled with laughter and games. She wondered if Emily and Thomas would have grown tall like their mother Catherine, if they would have gone off to university, if they would have families of their own by now. The thought pierced her like a knife, and she pressed the cup tightly to her lips as if the warmth could steady her against the wave of grief rising once more. Outside, the farm stood silent and unchanged, yet within Margaret something stirred, a whisper of intuition she could not explain. This year, this anniversary, felt as though it might finally bring an answer. Catherine Holloway arrived just after midday, her car pulling into the gravel drive with the familiar crunch that always seemed too loud against the stillness of the countryside. And when she stepped out, her arms were filled with flowers, white lilies and pale roses wrapped in paper that rustled in the breeze. She found her mother in the kitchen, sitting by the table with an untouched cup of tea, her eyes distant as though they were fixed on a place far beyond the window. Catherine placed the flowers down gently, her voice soft but firm as she reminded her that 20 years had passed and it was time to stop reopening old wounds, that the best way to honor Emily and Thomas was to remember the joy they had brought rather than dragging herself back into the mire of that day. Margaret listened in silence, her lined face unreadable, but her eyes betrayed her resolve, and when Catherine tried to persuade her further, she rose slowly from her chair and declared that she would walk down to the barn, whether her daughter joined her or not. They set out together, the damp grass soaking their shoes, the fields stretching wide and empty around them. And as they approached the weathered structure, its doors sagging on rusted hinges, Margaret felt her chest tighten with both dread and determination. Catherine hesitated at the threshold, whispering that there was no point in torturing herself with ghosts, but Margaret pressed on, her hand trailing along the rough wood as though trying to draw strength from its solidity. Inside, dust motes drifted in beams of muted sunlight cutting through gaps in the roof, and the air smelled of hay long since turned stale, the silence almost reverent as if the barn itself remembered what had been lost. Margaret stood in the center, staring at the spot where she had last seen Emily and Thomas, their laughter echoing faintly in her memory, and the weight of absence pressed so heavily upon her that she had to grip the edge of an old trough to steady herself. Catherine reached for her arm, urging her back into the light, insisting that nothing good could come of this. But Margaret shook her head, her voice low and steady as she said that unanswered questions had no respect for time. That 20 years might as well be 20 minutes when you never had the truth. She lingered a moment longer, the barn walls closing in around her like a coffin, then stepped back outside, her heart pounding with the certainty that the land still held secrets waiting to be unearthed. Peter Graham had taken to wandering the fields most weekends with his metal detector, a hobby he had picked up after his divorce 2 years earlier. The steady hum of the machine and the solitude of open land offering him a kind of peace he rarely found elsewhere. And on that particular Saturday afternoon, as the pale sun broke briefly through the low Somerset clouds, he found himself sweeping the detector over the uneven ground bordering the Holloway farm. The machine chirped dully at first, the usual scatter of bottle caps and bits of fencing wire, but then it gave a sharper, more insistent tone, the kind that pricked the hairs on the back of his neck, and he bent down to dig with careful hands, his spade cutting into the damp earth until it struck against metal. At first he thought it might be another discarded tool, but as the soil fell away it revealed a small tin box, rusted through at the edges, its lid clinging stubbornly before giving way with a reluctant creak. Inside lay objects that made him pause in disbelief. A school badge bearing the crest of Street. Mary's primary, dulled by age yet unmistakable, a broken toy car with wheels barely hanging on, and a ring of farm keys bound together by a faded ribbon. He sat back on his heels, the chill of the discovery washing over him, for he knew the Holloway children had vanished 20 years ago, their names spoken with sorrow at every village gathering, and here, only inches beneath the soil, were pieces of their lives sealed away as if hidden deliberately. Peter's breath caught in his throat as he brushed away the clinging dirt, the sight of those belongings stirring something deep within him, and for a long moment he simply knelt there, surrounded by the whisper of the wind across the field, unable to decide whether he should take the box straight to the authorities or first to Margaret herself. The thought of disturbing her after so many years gave him pause, but the weight of what he had found would not allow hesitation, and with hands trembling slightly he lifted the box from its resting place, cradling it as though it were something sacred. As he stood, the detector swinging idly at his side, he looked back over the hollow in the ground, already filling with rainwater, and felt a strange certainty settle upon him that this was not just a chance find, but the beginning of answers long buried. A truth that had been waiting all these years to rise from the earth. When Peter Graham carried the tin box to Margaret Holloway's cottage later that evening, his face was pale beneath the brim of his cap, and when he set it carefully on the worn wooden table between them, Margaret's hands began to tremble before the lid was even prized open. The faint metallic scrape as the rusted hinges gave way seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen. And as the contents were revealed under the dim light of the lamp, Margaret let out a gasp so sharp it seemed to tear from somewhere deep inside her. There it was, Emily's school badge with the blue and gold crest of Street. Mary's primary dulled but intact, something Margaret had polished herself countless mornings before pinning it neatly on her granddaughter's blazer. Next to it lay Thomas's toy car, the red paint chipped and its wheels askew, the very one he had carried in his pocket everywhere, even at the breakfast table when she used to scold him gently for never letting it go. And beside those rested a set of farm keys, bound by a ribbon long faded to a colorless strip of cloth, the same set her late husband had once used to lock up the barn and feed shed, a ring Margaret thought had been misplaced long ago. For a moment she could not breathe, her chest rising and falling in short, desperate bursts as her fingers hovered above the objects, afraid that touching them would shatter the fragile reality before her. Then she reached out at last, her fingertips brushing the cold metal of the badge, and the dam inside her broke. She crumpled into her chair, sobs racking her thin frame as the truth struck her with a force more brutal than any imagination of hope or despair had ever delivered in 20 years. These things had been with her grandchildren on the day they vanished, and their presence here proved beyond all doubt that Emily and Thomas had been nearby, not swept away by some stranger in a passing car, not spirited off without trace. But here, within the land she had walked every day since. Catherine rushed to her side, clutching her mother's shoulders, tears slipping down her own cheeks as she tried to steady her. But Margaret could only whisper the children's names over and over, each syllable a prayer, a lament, and an accusation all at once. The box sat open on the table, its relics gleaming faintly under the yellow glow of the lamp, and in that small room it felt as though time itself had folded back, carrying grief and memory into one unbearable moment. Detective Inspector Sarah Whitfield stood at the edge of the Holloway farm with her coat pulled tightly against the chill wind, her eyes scanning the familiar expanse of fields that had haunted the case files she had studied for weeks in preparation for reopening one of Somerset's most agonizing mysteries. And when she gave the order for the forensic team to begin their work, the land that had been silent for 2 decades stirred once more with the hum of machinery and the scrape of shovels cutting into damp earth. Margaret Holloway watched from the kitchen window of her cottage, her face pressed against the glass, her hands clenched around the edges of her cardigan, as though the fabric alone could steady her against the memories the sight evoked. Sarah had briefed her that morning, explaining in her calm, measured voice that the discovery of the tin box had altered everything, that it was no longer a closed chapter but a renewed investigation, and though Margaret had nodded, she had felt her heart pounding with both dread and hope. The forensic team moved with quiet precision, marking sections of the hedgerows where the soil appeared disrupted, and soon murmurs spread among them that certain areas showed signs of being disturbed in ways inconsistent with natural erosion. The sound of spades digging deeper carried through the farm, mingling with the cries of crows circling above, and villagers began to gather near the stone wall that bordered the lane, their whispers rising and falling as speculation rippled through the crowd. Many had lived with the unsolved disappearance of Emily and Thomas as a wound etched into the fabric of their community, and now old suspicions surfaced once more. Some muttered that no stranger could have taken the children without being seen, not in broad daylight, not from land so closely watched. Others exchanged uneasy glances, hinting at the possibility that someone local, someone trusted, had been responsible all along. Sarah moved between her officers with brisk authority, kneeling to examine each find, each patch of disturbed ground, her brow furrowed as though she were piecing together a puzzle buried beneath layers of time and silence. As the afternoon light began to fade, the field looked scarred by trenches and markers, a battlefield of memory and loss. And Margaret, watching from her window, felt tears sting her eyes. For the first time in 20 years, the farm was no longer silent witness to absence, but an active participant in a search for truth that could no longer be ignored. Margaret Holloway sat at her kitchen table staring into the steam rising from her untouched tea. As the sound of the police combing the fields drifted faintly through the open window, and as her eyes wandered to the far boundary of the land, half obscured by tangled hedgerows and brambles, her thoughts turned unwillingly to the old cottage that had stood empty for more than a decade, the one that had belonged to her late husband's brother George. She could almost see it in her mind, its crooked roofline sagging against the sky, its windows clouded with grime, and she shivered despite the warmth of the room. George Holloway had been a difficult man, sour and secretive, with a resentment that stretched back years, fueled by disputes over land and bitterness at his own misfortunes. Margaret remembered too well the sharp arguments they had had across the farm gate, his voice rising as he accused her husband of favoritism in their father's will. And later, after her husband's death, the way George's hostility had turned upon her, muttering that she had no right to the land, no right to the family name. Though the children had always been told to keep away from his cottage, she recalled catching glimpses of Emily's bright hair or Thomas's small figure as they dared each other to run past the old path that led to his door, giggling in the way only children could, unaware of the shadows adults carried. When Emily and Thomas vanished, the thought had brushed against her mind once or twice that George might have known something, but the police at the time had found nothing linking him, and she had silenced herself, convincing her heart it was only grief looking for a villain. Now, as Detective Inspector Sarah Whitfield asked questions about old family tensions, Margaret found herself speaking of George for the first time in years, her voice low and steady as she described his bitterness, his loneliness, and the darkness that seemed to hang about his cottage like a fog. The officers exchanged glances and made notes, their interest sharpening as they considered the abandoned property, long left to rot on the edge of the fields. Margaret's stomach twisted with dread as she realized that her memories of George's glare, his muttered threats, and the unkind smile that never reached his eyes were no longer just echoes of family quarrels, but pieces of a puzzle she had not dared to fit together. The cottage stood silent and broken. Yet in its crumbling stones there might still be secrets buried as deep as the sorrow that had haunted the Holloway name for 20 years. The police station smelled faintly of old paper and damp wool, as Detective Inspector Sarah Whitfield spread the reopened case files across a long wooden table, and Margaret Holloway sat nearby with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the scattered evidence that seemed at once familiar and foreign, relics of a time she had tried and failed to lock away. It was then that an officer carried in a battered cardboard box from storage, its corners frayed and its label smudged with age, and placed it carefully before Sarah. Inside were possessions collected during the first investigation in 2004, many of which had been logged, photographed, and forgotten when no clear leads emerged. Among them, tucked beneath a stack of yellowed witness statements, was a small journal bound in faded pink. The cover scuffed and the spine split, its pages frayed at the edges as though it had been handled often by small hands. Margaret's breath caught as she recognized it instantly as belonging to Emily, her beloved granddaughter, who had scribbled stories and kept notes of her days with the seriousness only a 10-year-old could muster. Sarah, donning gloves, turned the fragile pages one by one, her brow furrowing as she skimmed neat, childish handwriting that spoke of school plays, favorite books, and days helping on the farm. But further in, the entries grew strange. Her letters larger, darker, and uneven, and there were words that made the room fall silent. Uncle George's cellar. It read in one place, underlined twice as though the importance had pressed heavily on Emily's young mind. Another page spoke in cryptic phrases of a secret he said never to tell, written with a shaky hand that made Margaret's chest constrict, as though her granddaughter's fear reached across the years to touch her even now. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, and Sarah leaned back slowly in her chair, tapping her pen against the table as though considering the weight of what she had uncovered. Margaret pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, her tears blurring the words on the page she had once read aloud to Emily as bedtime stories. And now it was her granddaughter's own words that whispered from the grave. The room was thick with the echo of things left unsaid, and the mention of George Holloway's cellar seemed less like a child's fancy and more like a signpost long ignored. Margaret whispered Emily's name under her breath, the syllables fragile as glass, and felt the ground shift beneath her as if the truth she had feared for 20 years was rising inexorably from the dark. The air was heavy with damp and the smell of mildew as the police gathered outside George Holloway's long-abandoned cottage, its roofline sagging like a weary shoulder beneath the weight of years, ivy twisting up its stone walls, as if nature itself had tried to strangle the house into silence. Margaret Holloway stood at the gate with Detective Inspector Sarah Whitfield at her side, her thin frame trembling as she clutched the edge of her cardigan, unable to believe she had returned to this place that had loomed over her thoughts for 2 decades, like a spectre in the distance. When the officers forced the door open, the wood splintered with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the quiet lane, sending a flock of crows screeching into the slate-grey sky. Inside, the air was stagnant, the walls stained with mold and damp, the remnants of furniture collapsed in heaps of rot, and the floorboards groaned under the weight of each cautious step. It was one of the younger detectives who spotted the odd patch of floor, boards newer than the rest, hammered hastily and unevenly, and when the crowbars were brought in, the sound of nails ripping free filled the cottage like a scream. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, her breathing shallow as the boards gave way to reveal stonework beneath, a section of bricked wall where no foundation should have been, sealed off and forgotten. The forensics team worked with chisels and hammers, each strike dull and deliberate, the dust rising in choking clouds that made the torchlight shimmer like mist, and the deeper they went, the more certain it became that something had been deliberately hidden below. Margaret turned away for a moment, her eyes fixed on the hedgerows that bordered the fields, but the thud of tools against brick pulled her back, and she found herself whispering Emily and Thomas's names, as if speaking them aloud might somehow shield them from what lay beneath. When at last the bricks began to crumble, revealing a hollow space descending into darkness, a shiver ran through every person present, as though the house itself had been holding its breath for 20 years and was finally exhaling secrets it could no longer contain. Sarah's face was grim as she signaled for torches to be lowered into the opening, and Margaret, her knees weakening beneath her, clutched the gatepost for support, knowing that whatever lay within those walls would change everything, that the earth was about to surrender what it had guarded all these long years. The cellar yawned open like a wound as the last of the bricks crumbled, and when the officers lowered themselves carefully into the hollow space, their torches cut through decades of darkness to reveal what no one wanted, but everyone had feared. 2 small skeletons lying side by side on the damp earth, their bones fragile and discolored by time, yet arranged with a stillness that suggested they had not been disturbed since the day they were placed there. For a moment the silence was absolute, even the birds outside seemed to hold their breath, and then one of the forensic officers lifted a torch closer, and the beam illuminated the tattered remains of clothing, a faded blue dress with buttons dulled by rust, and the remnants of a jumper with a stripe still visible across the chest. And Margaret Holloway, watching from above with trembling hands clutched to her face, let out a cry so raw it seemed to tear through the walls of the ruined cottage. It was Emily's dress, the one she had worn to Sunday service, and Thomas's jumper, the one she had knitted herself the previous winter, both unmistakable even after 20 years of decay. Catherine fell to her knees at her mother's side, holding her tightly as if she could stop her from collapsing entirely, while Detective Inspector Sarah Whitfield gave a curt order to secure the scene, her face pale though her voice remained steady. News traveled quickly through the village, carried in hurried whispers from neighbor to neighbor until small clusters of people gathered in the lane, their faces etched with shock and sorrow, some weeping openly, others shaking their heads as if refusing to accept the truth laid bare. For years, the disappearance of Emily and Thomas had lingered as a wound without closure, a mystery that haunted every corner of the community, and now the confirmation of their deaths, here on the very land they had once played upon, sent ripples of horror through every soul who had prayed they might still be alive somewhere. Margaret's body shook with sobs as she whispered their names again and again, her voice catching like a broken hymn. And though Catherine clung to her, both women were swept under the same wave of grief, the kind that leaves no room for words, only silence and the unbearable sound of bones being carefully lifted from the soil that had cradled them in darkness for 2 long decades. The discovery of the children's remains had already cast a suffocating silence over the Holloway farm, yet as the forensic team widened their search of the cellar, the sound of chisels striking against stone brought a fresh wave of dread that rippled through everyone standing above. Detective Inspector Sarah Whitfield leaned close to the jagged wall where the mortar had begun to crumble, and when a section finally gave way, it revealed a narrow opening, a hidden passage leading into a darker recess that had remained sealed from light for 2 decades. Officers crouched low and pushed forward with torches raised, their beams sweeping over the cramped space until they halted abruptly, illuminating objects that told a far more harrowing story than bones alone ever could. Against one wall lay bedding, a thin mattress long rotted through, its stuffing spilling out in clumps like pale weeds sprouting from decay, and beside it sat a scatter of tins, their labels faded and curling but still faintly legible. Soup, beans, and peaches. Provisions meant for sustaining life rather than ending it. Nearby, lengths of rope coiled like sleeping snakes across the dirt floor, some frayed, others knotted, all lying as mute witnesses to something unspeakable. The implication struck like a hammer blow, for it suggested Emily and Thomas had not died immediately on that summer's day in 2004, but had been kept here, hidden within the shadows of their uncle's cottage, alive long enough to require food, bedding, and confinement. Margaret Holloway's breath hitched when Sarah relayed what had been found, her knees buckling so that Catherine had to hold her upright, and the old woman's sobs echoed into the empty lane, the sound carrying as far as the waiting villagers who pressed against the wall outside, their murmurs rising into a chorus of disbelief and horror. The image of her grandchildren imprisoned beneath the very land she had walked daily was almost too much to bear, a truth so cruel it made her heart clench as though it were being squeezed by an iron hand. Sarah's expression was grim, her eyes glinting with the resolve of someone piecing together the bleakest of puzzles, and she instructed her officers to document every inch of the hidden chamber. As photographs clicked and evidence bags filled, the space revealed itself not as a resting place but as a prison, a secret George Holloway had built into the foundations of his own home, a place where innocence had been trapped and terror had lingered long before the earth claimed its silence. George Holloway had been dead for 10 years, his body laid to rest in a quiet corner of the churchyard with little ceremony. His name muttered more with relief than mourning. Yet, in the wake of the cellar's grim revelations, his shadow seemed to rise anew, spreading across the village like a dark stain that refused to be scrubbed away. It was Mrs. Edith Clark, a neighbor well into her 80s, who shuffled forward to speak when word of the discovery reached the row of cottages, her voice quavering as she recalled evenings when George had stumbled home from the pub, reeking of ale, muttering loudly about how he was the only one who truly cared for those poor children, how he had kept them safe from their own father. Words most had dismissed at the time as drunken nonsense. Now, with bones unearthed and a hidden chamber revealed, those words echoed with a new and sinister weight, and Edith's watery eyes brimmed with fear as she whispered that perhaps they had all chosen not to hear what was being said too plainly. When police later collected what little remained of George's belongings from storage, among the rusted tools and old clothes were several battered notebooks, their covers smudged with dirt, their pages filled with obsessive, uneven scrawl. Within them, George had ranted about family betrayal, about his brother favoring Catherine over him, about Margaret taking what should have been his, but woven through the bitterness was a disturbing thread, passages fixated on Emily and Thomas, describing them as pure souls he needed to protect, even from their own blood. One entry spoke of Richard, their father, with venom, hinting at sins never proven but always whispered in corners, painting him as dangerous and unfit. A man George claimed he had to shield the children from, though his definition of protection had twisted into something grotesque. Detective Inspector Sarah Whitfield read the notebooks aloud to her team in the station's cramped briefing room, her voice steady though her jaw clenched, and Margaret sat nearby, her heart clenching as she heard her brother-in-law's words, torn between rage and horror at the delusion that had led him to imprison and ultimately doom her grandchildren. The notebooks were not confessions in the traditional sense, but they revealed a mind warped by bitterness, paranoia, and obsession. A man who had made himself judge and jailer, and though he was long buried, his words lingered like poison. A confession from the grave that explained everything and nothing all at once. Richard Holloway sat in the stark interview room of the Somerset police station, the overhead light casting harsh shadows across his lined face, his hands trembling slightly as they lay clasped on the table before him. And though he was now in his 60s with thinning hair and a weariness that seemed to seep into his very bones, the questions brought before him dragged him back 2 decades, to a time when suspicion clung to his name like smoke that could not be washed away. Detective Inspector Sarah Whitfield spoke with calm precision, reminding him that at the time of Emily and Thomas's disappearance in 2004, there had been an active investigation into allegations of abuse made by a neighbor and quietly whispered by teachers at St. Mary's Primary. Allegations that had never been substantiated in court, but had been enough to leave a lingering stain on his reputation. Richard's eyes flickered as he denied the charges once more, his voice breaking with frustration as he insisted he had loved his children, that he would never have harmed them. But each word fell heavy in the silence of the room, weighted by years of doubt and gossip that had never quite been silenced. Margaret, waiting outside the room, pressed her trembling hands together as she listened to the low hum of voices through the wall, her heart aching with the memory of bitter arguments between George and Richard, arguments she had once dismissed as family quarrels, but which now loomed like omens. For it seemed George had twisted his resentment into a conviction that his brother was dangerous and unfit. In his warped mind, George had taken Emily and Thomas away to protect them, a protection that instead condemned them to a cellar where hope turned to terror and life ebbed slowly into death. When Sarah placed George's notebooks on the table before Richard, his eyes scanned the jagged handwriting, his expression shifting between anger, confusion, and despair, and though he repeated his innocence, the implication hung heavy in the room, that George's actions, born from hatred and obsession, had been fueled by fears that perhaps had roots in truth, or perhaps were only the paranoid inventions of a bitter man. The village murmured once more with divided voices, some recalling Richard's short temper and the way Emily had grown quieter in his presence, others insisting he was no more than a grieving father falsely accused. But for Margaret, the knowledge was unbearable. For whichever way the truth bent, it had been family that had destroyed family, blood turning against blood, until 2 innocent children had been lost forever. The village gathered beneath the grey Somerset sky as the church bells tolled slowly, each chime carrying across the damp fields like a lament, and in the churchyard where flowers had already begun to pile at the base of the old stone wall, the remains of Emily and Thomas Holloway were formally laid to rest after 20 long years of silence. The coroner's report had confirmed beyond doubt what Margaret had already known in her bones the moment she saw the clothing, and as she stood with Catherine at her side, her thin hands gripping the prayer book tightly, she felt her grief sharpen into something far more complex, a mixture of rage at George for betraying them so monstrously and guilt that she had not protected her grandchildren from the fate that had stolen them. Villagers surrounded them with bowed heads, some clutching candles, others murmuring prayers, their faces etched with the collective sorrow of a community finally confronted with truth. Yet the Holloway family's private anguish bled into the open air. Catherine's eyes, red-rimmed from nights without sleep, burned with a fury that would not be calmed, and after the service she turned to her father Richard, her voice trembling but firm, demanding he admit what had driven George to act as he did. Richard, older now, his shoulders stooped beneath the weight of years and accusations, tried to brush her off, muttering that George had been mad, that his ravings meant nothing, but Catherine pressed harder, her voice carrying through the hushed crowd, asking him directly whether there had been something more, something he had hidden, something George had seized upon in his twisted sense of righteousness. Richard's silence stretched unbearably long, his eyes fixed on the ground, and though he gave no words, the hesitation alone was enough to stir unease among those who listened, enough to make Catherine's sobs turn to bitter curses as she accused him of creating the very conditions that had doomed her children. Margaret closed her eyes, torn apart by the spectacle, for she loved her daughter and mourned with her. But she also saw the frailty in Richard's face, the look of a man who had lost everything and had perhaps always lived under shadows he could never outrun. The candles flickered in the evening wind, the graves lay freshly turned, and as the mourners drifted away in silence, Margaret stood between the two halves of her fractured family, caught in a chasm of betrayal, guilt, and unbearable love that no truth, however unearthed, could ever mend. The coroner's court was packed with villagers, reporters, and officials, the weight of 20 years pressing into the small, oak-paneled room as the inquest into the deaths of Emily and Thomas Holloway began, and Margaret sat at the front with Catherine beside her, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white, her eyes fixed on the coroner who read from the findings in a voice that was calm, yet heavy with gravity. The evidence gathered from the cellar, the hidden chamber, the decayed bedding, and the tins of food painted a picture too bleak for anyone to deny, and the forensic specialists who had studied the remains spoke with clinical precision about malnutrition, lack of ventilation, and the clear signs of prolonged confinement, their words slicing through the air like knives. The verdict, when it came, was blunt and devastating, that Emily and Thomas had been unlawfully killed, their deaths caused not by sudden violence but by neglect and imprisonment that robbed them slowly of breath, strength, and hope. The words seemed to suck the air from the room, and Margaret bowed her head, her shoulders shaking as she wept quietly, the grief as raw now as it had been in 2004, yet mingled with a strange sense of release. For though the truth was brutal, it was truth at last, not the endless torment of unanswered questions. Catherine, her jaw set, stared at her father Richard across the aisle, her eyes burning with the accusation she still could not voice, while villagers behind them exchanged hushed murmurs, some shaking their heads, others pressing handkerchiefs to wet faces, for the conclusion confirmed what many had feared but had never dared to say aloud, that the children had suffered not at the hands of strangers, but within the walls of their own kin's house. When the coroner finally closed the inquest, the scrape of his chair loud against the floor, Margaret rose on unsteady legs and looked towards the window where weak sunlight broke through the clouds, and in that fragile light she felt both devastation and relief, as if the weight of silence had been lifted even while the grief of knowledge pressed her down. The gavel fell, the room emptied slowly, and as Margaret stepped into the chill air outside, she clutched Catherine's hand tightly, whispering that though their hearts were broken, at least They no longer wandered lost in darkness, for the truth, however cruel, had finally been spoken. The morning was bright but cool as Margaret Holloway walked slowly across the churchyard, her steps steady though every movement carried the weight of 2 decades of grief, and in her arms she held a small bouquet of white roses, their petals trembling faintly in the breeze. Catherine walked beside her, silent, her eyes fixed ahead where 2 freshly carved headstones stood side by side, the names of Emily and Thomas Holloway etched in clean, sharp letters that seemed at once too new and yet long overdue, marking a presence that had never truly left. Around the graves lay wreaths from neighbors, ribbons inscribed with prayers from classmates now grown, and the tokens of a village that had lived under the shadow of mystery for far too long. Margaret knelt with effort, her joints stiff with age, and placed the roses gently at the base of the stone, her fingers lingering against the cold marble as if willing it to warm under her touch. Then, with trembling hands, she lifted the rusted tin box that had begun it all. Now cleaned and preserved by the forensic team, its metal still scarred but solid, and set it carefully atop the grave. It was not just a container of relics, but a vessel of truth, a symbol of what had been hidden and was now laid bare. And Margaret whispered her grandchildren's names as she pressed her hand against it, her voice soft, yet carrying in the quiet morning air. Catherine placed a hand on her mother's shoulder, her face pale with sorrow but also with a strange peace. For though nothing could erase the cruelty of what had happened, there was finally an end to the questions that had tormented them both. Beyond the churchyard walls, the Holloway farm stretched out in muted colors, its hedgerows newly turned by spades, and its barns weathered but standing, no longer haunted by secrets, but transformed into a place where truth had been unearthed and silence broken. Villagers spoke of it differently now, not as a land cursed by suspicion, but as ground that had borne witness and finally yielded its story. And Margaret, rising slowly from her knees, felt the shift within her as well. The grief would never vanish, she knew, but it no longer wandered aimless, for it had a place to rest, a stone to mark it, and a story told without shadows. The farm, once a place of absence, had become a place of remembrance. And in that transformation, Margaret found the fragile beginnings of peace